Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're here with Forrest Miller, one of the many hosts of Movie Night Extravaganza.
And movie host of This Is Revolution right now. I got ready to put the hat down because I thought that's what you're going to say. That's why.
Right. And movie host of This Is Revolution on the Wednesday series, where we both are regulars on I think the third Wednesday of the month. It's my gaming show with Gene Bajelon. You guys are first Wednesday, right?
Yeah, first Wednesday of the month, and which sometimes I think means the 5th or the 6th, and sometimes means the 1st, depending on the month.
Right. So, Forrest, you've been doing a movie podcast for the last, I don't know, a few months. You've done a ton of movies in not a lot of time.
Yeah, I think we're hitting episode 25 tomorrow in, I want to say 4 months, but it might be 3 months.
Right. You like me overproduce. I hit in 5 months. I've hit episode 40 of my podcast and like 50 something of the stream. So I feel you. So what makes Movie Night Extravaganza interesting to me is that usually, but not always, it's not a political show, but because of your prior producing experience and because of your own interest, almost all your guests come out of the realm of political commentary, or at least are adjacent to it.
Yeah, I mean, I would call it a leftist movie podcast because it always kind of involves elements of. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a Marxist movie podcast because a lot of our guests probably aren't, but at least left adjacent movie podcast. So I don't think it could not be. I don't think that even if I wanted it to be.
And it's often a very free-form movie podcast. You've tightened up the format in the last few months, although I remember my first couple of visits on the show as one of your panelists, we were longer than the movie significantly.
Yeah, that's happened quite a few times. Yesterday we kind of loosened back up because it was we were doing kind of the entire Halloween franchise, whatever everybody wanted to talk about. So it ended up being like 3 hours, and I was like, no one's gonna fucking watch this.
Yeah. Well, long streams are interesting because they tend to have a high engagement rate during their stream, but they also don't tend to get watched more than a month out. So, but then again, that's true for all streams. What would you say have you learned from the movies that you've done? You've done a pretty big mix of what some people would consider not art house, but movie classics mixed in with maybe what people would consider like grindhouse or B movie classics.
Yeah, some of them. I mean, I think more. Well, we kind of just go with whatever it hits our fancy, I guess, for the week. Sometimes I've had guests say, "Hey, I want to do this, do this movie, and can I come on?" The last This Is Revolution one that I did was with Conan Neutron, and he's been wanting to do The Player for a really long time. So we ended up doing The Player, and which is not a movie that I've seen until then, but I was excited to see it. I mean, because Robert Altman's a really good director, one of the first new Hollywood, I guess, type directors, and that's not exactly a part of the part of I guess Hollywood history that I've ever really wanted to engage with as much as other parts, like older noir stuff. In college, I really got into older Hollywood stuff. I'm kind of fascinated by the old studio system. I'm fascinated by the Hays Code. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a focus that I have that I don't really get to express very often, and I've been happy to on this show. And then I think newer stuff a lot of times is kind of a must. We did Parasite, and you were on that stream, and we did. We've done we did Snowpiercer, we did. Sorry to Bother You. We did, just a whole bunch of leftist, newer stuff.
So, this brings us to radical art and radical content in movies. I have the somewhat unpopular opinion amongst leftists that most leftist art outside of film, and I actually will talk about why I think film is the exception, sucks. So, I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
I don't disagree.
A lot of it has to do with the fact that leftists tend to be didactic in the way that they approach their material. Film seems to be the exception, and the exception has to do, I think, kind of with the nature of the medium. It's very, very hard to make a didactic film that isn't even obvious to the people making it that it's bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that really gets leftist directors, and I'm happy they've kind of moved away from this, is like way too much dialogue, way too much like exposition, and like really trying to hammer your point home. And I think audiences don't respond to that whatsoever. And it's interesting. I think liberal filmmakers more than anything have really hammered their point home in recent times. And like the fact that audiences are pretty instantly like, whoa, like I don't want to fucking see this. I want to be entertained. I don't want to have like, I don't want to have your social commentary like preached to me. Like movies like, I think movies like even like Get Out, which is obviously a liberal movie, but like movies that kind of hide it within either the horror genre or like a fantasy genre, or I think go down with audiences a lot better.
Right. Well, that's true in literature too. I mean, if you look at where you can get away with political literature that tends to go well, that doesn't seem preachy, it's speculative fiction. It does seem like the last few years have been the years of the preachy liberal movie, or the preaching moderate movie. My examples of that would be Hillbilly Elegy, when Ron Howard decides to make a conservative screed that I actually think at some level actually portrays like lower middle class white Ohio and upper Appalachian life somewhat accurately, but has all these weird screedy points in it. And he, gets awesome actors and makes it the most anodyne, safe, middle of the road movie you can possibly make it, and of course everybody hates it. But I made it through
the first 50 minutes of Hillbilly Elegy and then fell asleep. I really wasn't that entertained by it. I watched it for Karthik and I were trying to watch everything that was like nominated for an Oscar, because we did that well, it ended up being a This Is Revolution Oscar stream, but originally we were gonna like write something, and it was like, I don't know, we didn't really know like the format for it, so I watched a bunch of just like whatever was nominated for Oscars, which I never do. I feel like I watch movies that are nominated for the Oscars this year, like a couple years later. And Hillbilly Elegy, I don't know. It was interesting that movie came out the same year as Nomadland, right? Because I think the liberal side of that is Nomadland. Like we're not going to do anything about it. Amazon funds us, but like we want to make sure that that like these people living van life, as Jason calls it, like hashtag van life, like these people living in RVs, like they're human. They might be homeless, but like they have stories. And Hillbilly Elegy, everyone was kind of a very one-sided character, and the message was purely like pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You know what I mean? Like that's the only like, oh, you can get out of this mess. Like if you're in Midwestern Ohio still or whatever, like living this way, like it's your fault. You're not working.
Yeah,
hard.
Which is an interesting thing about J.D. Vance that people should know. I think I talked about this after I watched that movie.
Friend of Kenzo, J.D. Vance.
Really?
No. Kenzo had a J.D. Vance. His friend does an impression of him, I guess, and makes like these videos where he pretends to be J.D. Vance. So he interviewed his friend as J.D. Vance like the other day.
Gotcha. So J.D. Vance was a non-grunt. Got a non-grunt position in the military when he went in. That got him access to an Ohio senator, who was also serving, and that's kind of how he progressed up the academic chain so quickly. He worked for that senator, and once you have that, you know how that goes. I've heard that story from multiple places. It's completely not in the book or the movie. So
there's other things that like the differences between the book and the movie. Like him like finding his mother like OD'd or whatever, and like, you know, trying to pay for her to go to rehab. Like all these heroic moments don't even happen in the book. Like he's not even trying to make himself into this hero. Like even to the point that like Ron Howard was trying to make him into.
Right. But what's also interesting is Ron Howard also tries to take 90% of the political content of that book, because most of it is a screed out. And he also takes a lot of the really unflattering stuff about the white working class out. I mean, he other than the drug-addled mother, you know, I come from a class background like that. Actually, that movie should have hit home for me, and it for 30 seconds then, and then I got mad because I was like, it still cleaned it up, like it still did whatever. I watched all the Oscar movies this year because I was interested in them. I liked one of them, and its name has already left my mind, which is about the Korean farmers. It's a movie shot.
Oh, Minari.
Yeah,
I really like that
yeah.
too. I really like that movie too.
Which I thought was good. Everything else I thought was basically feel bad liberal agitprop.
Yeah, well, I mean, which is always what, you know, the Oscars really is. Like that's why I don't really watch Oscars movies most of the time. I'm like, I could be watching any number of things right now.
Well, it's interesting when I compare Oscars movies from the 70s, which have their own problems, but were interesting, versus Oscar movies from the last 10 years. Which Oscar movies from the last 10 years tend to either flatter liberal sensibilities or flatter Hollywood. And this last run was mostly feel-bad movies. I think Parasite winning was, or a year before, was important, but I
thought we had best foreign film, Parasite. What was that all about?
Well, you know, since like 3/4 of the actors in American movies are British anyway, we should probably just drop the separation in category.
Yeah, no, but there should be a separation category. It kind of puts Hollywood up on a pedestal, which is what the Oscars kind of do in general, right? Like, you know, as you said, like it's a lot of movies that flatter Hollywood. Like, of course, they're not going to want like competition to start kicking in.
Well, I mean, the Golden Globes would kind of be competition, except that you can buy awards. So, yeah. It's interesting though, because I think the cinema territory is in a weird way right now, and we all know it from COVID. Nobody's been in films. The thing is, cinema attendance has been declining for 10 years. The growth model for cinema since before I even left the country has been get people in their seats in like China and South Korea and rich parts of India, make movies that are fairly anodyne. I mean, it's both why movies are like universally enjoyable, but why the stakes are so huge, why they're mostly Marvel, why they're mostly based on like adolescent tropes, and why there's not been a sex scene in a movie for 10 years. It's because the market has to be so broad to recoup cost.
It's interesting when I think that our cultural moment clashes with that, because I was thinking a bit recently about because I was listening to the Alex Cox as a podcast where he mentioned this, the fact that, like, you know, there's a whole thing about Tilda Swinton in Doctor Strange, you know, obviously being like a white British woman playing a character that was played by like a Tibetan, like a male Tibetan character in the comics. Right. And everyone's like, oh, why did she do that? Why did she do that? And it's because the Chinese government, like the CCP, wouldn't let a Tibetan character, because, you know, Marvel takes the script to all these different governments. Like, I'm not just, you know, like ragging on China with this, but like, you know, like in order to get the movie accepted in all of these different markets, you have to kind of make concessions, which is something that Marvel is and like Disney is very willing to do when it's, you know, things like that. So all of a sudden, this whole backlash kind of happened against Tilda Swinton, and like sitting there, like after the fact, being like, oh, well, why was she cast in that role? And it's like she's cast in that role because, you know, you have to have a certain, you know, a certain type of, you have to have a certain, I guess, cultural concessions to each market that you put your film into.
Right, and I know this is I don't mean to sound condescending, but it is sometimes a shock to people that our obsessions with people playing their ethnicities, and all ethnicities being represented, is not a concern of foreign moviegoers in the same way. It's just not.
Yeah.
I think about that China funded movie that had Matt Damon in it. It's like, what? But the other thing about that's interesting, right? I also thought, like, well, what if they had cast it with an Asian actor and just made him not Tibetan or something? It would have been an Orientalist stereotype because it was the source materials from the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it's kind of racist. I mean, the modern Doctor Strange version of that character isn't, but the first 3 decades are. So I find that going back to
it's also it would be incredibly offensive, I think, to replace a Tibetan character with like a Chinese act. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's like while what's happening with Tibet and China is happening, like just, you know, swapping out a Tibetan character for a Chinese character, I think is far more offensive than just like throwing Tilda Swinton in there.
Right. Well, I mean, that I remember, and this is how old I am. I remember when I was in college and Memoirs of a Geisha came out, and they're casting Chinese and Taiwanese actors as Japanese, which kind of made all sides of that equation mad, particularly in the context of World War II.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in some ways, yeah, we've gotten better on some of this stuff. In other ways, we absolutely haven't.
But there's also, you know, like Asians and then Asian Americans, and Asian Americans seeing themselves as a group that gets represented a certain way, but then also Asian, you know, governments seeing themselves represented in film a certain way. It gets to be incredibly complicated. And I don't think that, like, in a U.S. centric mindset where you're just sitting in a you know, a movie audience, not thinking about like any kind of geopolitical strategy when it comes to making movies, which I should say I'm not dogging on China or any other, you know, government, because like the U.S. military funds like most movies, including Marvel movies.
I was going to say most all Marvel movies have U.S. military involvement. Like,
so you're trying to, if you're Marvel, you're trying to please a lot of different diametrically opposed markets,
right
within that.
I mean,
no, but so like, I don't think that, but like, you're not thinking about that as just some like random person going to see a Marvel movie. Something that you might be assuaged by as like a liberal journalist writing on on Facebook or something, being like, listen, Tilda Swinton in this movie, and then that's a whole nother group of people now that are invested in the movie. Well, ticket sales, but not literally invested the same way that like the military is, but like ticket sales all of a sudden are up in arms because you know what I mean. Like, some people are going to now boycott the movie, and like Disney doesn't want anyone boycotting the movie. So it's a funny, like the amount of different like groups I think that has to be appeased in that equation is pretty hilarious.
Yeah. One thing I will say, the most recent example of this for me, where the politics are just incoherent because Disney can't be, is Black Widow's new movie, because we're going to set it in like 1995 to 1998, but somehow still have this vague, maybe Soviet Union, maybe Cuban communist super soldier program that no one knows how it still exists because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, even in the context of the movie. And that's also not brought up, like apparently 1992 never happened, or the Soviet Union never happened. It was just, it ends up being a totally incoherent mess where you're like, is this a Cold War movie? It doesn't even make sense for that.
Well, maybe it's like the one Japanese guy that at the end of World War II that like came out of like a really, really dense like woods like 10 years after World War II ended, and was just like assuming that it was still going on.
Yeah, that's the Black Widow program, and so it doesn't even make sense. I find it interesting to compare the early Marvel movies, which I think are for mid-brow movies that were even would say Iron Man, the first one, were marketed to an international audience. How different they are than the current ones, partly because like they still were commenting on specific American politics. Go back and watch Iron Man 1, and there's stuff about like the Bush era anti-terrorist programs and stuff in it. It's really anodyne, but it's in there.
Yeah. Well, and it's also kind of inescapable within that story, I think, at that time. You know what I mean? Like in 2008, I think it's inescapable to like comment on that instead of like, I mean, we're kind of in a really fucking weird point in like the war on terror. At this point, you can kind of gloss over all of that and just be like, listen, military, military contractors, it's fine. You know what I mean? Like Obama had them, like we had Trump, we have Biden. Like, listen, it's,
right.
it's a bipartisan effort.
So the kind of anodyne semi-liberal sensibilities that you see in those movies, they get more concentrated in the Oscar bait, right? And I started noticing this probably, for me, the movie where I thought this was most glaringly obvious was not Green Book or anything like that. It was Dallas Buyers Club, which was, I saw it in Mexico. I was living in Mexico at the time when that movie came out. And all the
is it Tijuana Buyers Club there? Or
no.
I'm just kidding.
I could actually talk about international cinema because this is interesting. It's really hard if you live in some of these countries to watch movies from that country in that country on a big screen sometimes. Like Bong Joon-ho movies and stuff will be on big screens in Korea, but the vast majority of what was in cinemas is American mass-produced movies. That's also true in Mexico. That's also true. So what I find interesting, part of the reason why you're seeing more and more foreign cinema marketed to the U.S. is, while this started way back, like you remember in 1999 when we've had like our first Hong Kong movie wave with like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, really getting into popular culture. Well, what's happened since then for those movies is that if you're a director in Korea and you're established and you're not making movies that can play in both a Korean and a US audience, you probably can't even get into that many Korean theaters.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I saw Dallas Buyers Club because I couldn't see a good Mexican movie because there was only like one in the entire cinema that week.
Well, we're in the age of the multinational corporation. Like, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, everything is kind of funded by a very small group of companies that all have deals with each other.
Right. So but almost everything is a Chinese Hollywood joint venture now. Like,
yeah.
So you have that, and with Dallas Buyers Club, you do get it marketed to an American sensibility, but it is an American sensibility that is very specific for the Oscars, but also for a kind of upper mid-brow NPR listening audience. And recently, before COVID, the big example of this, and I don't mean to totally shit on this movie, but it was kind of bad, was Harriet. The Harriet Tubman biopic.
Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah, it's just don't bother. I went and watched it with a woman I was dating who was from Peru, and we were just like, whoa. We also couldn't figure out exactly who it was marketed towards, because you go in and you can tell a film when you used to go into theaters by who it's really aimed towards by the previews, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the previews for Harriet were a mixture of Tyler Perry movies and like clearly Oscar bait biopics. And so I was like, wait, this is a weird audience, but it's gotten that specific. What I've found interesting about the last few years is I think a lot of people are watching genre movies now because there's more innovation in them. They are not aimed at an international market, and so they're fairly safe. And then while I don't think this will last forever, in the past 3 or 4 years, we've had Netflix and Amazon step in and fill the gap of what used to be the new line cinema, sort of like quasi prestige movie.
Yeah.
Are a quasi experimental movie because they want to generate more and more content for their own platforms. Now, of course, eventually what they're going to do is bait and switch it out for blockbusters, and that we've already seen them start pivoting that way.
They have like The Boys, I'd say on Amazon is kind of an early attempt at that, I think, although for a very specific audience. You know what I mean? Like, it's since it's a Garth Ennis comic, like I don't think it's for like everybody, but like it still is kind of a it's a superhero show for a pretty mass audience.
Right.
Although a not easily offended audience, because there's some pretty fucked up things in there. I mean, maybe not fucked up like the comics are, but it's still Garth Ennis.
So what I think we're gonna see in the immediate future, I actually do think the comic book movie seems to be dying down, right? Like, I think that's mostly good because like I haven't seen a good DC movie in forever, and honestly, also the Marvel movies are so written by committee that even though they get good directors, you can't really tell. I remember learning that
I'd say Thor Ragnarok was an exception to that.
Right, you can tell that's Taika Waititi, but
yeah.
But yeah, but the rest of them like everything it is a committee sort of deal.
What did you think of Black Panther? Like, I'm sure you have plenty of more complex thoughts on that.
Well, I think it was great that it broke Chad Boseman out, even though we didn't get a long time of him being in the public eye.
Yeah,
I think it was. I think as a cultural touchstone moment, it's important to have a Black lead character in the Marvel movies. I actually think the Black Panther specific version of Afrofuturism is. I mean, one, it was invented by a white guy, but two, like, which isn't in and of itself not necessarily bad. It's just something that people have to actually kind of deal with. And two, it's a kind of reactionary futurism. I mean, it's basically feudal.
Yeah.
And European feudal at that. Like, it's not really, totally based in African traditions, even though the design of the movie was. Also making Killmonger a national liberationist and then making the good guy the CIA just can't really be dropped. I mean, that's
I think even more complicated than that. That complicated it for me, like as someone that was kind of thinking more about like geopolitics during the time that I finally saw it. Like, neoliberalization is the end of the movie. You know what I mean? Like.
Right.
They've like it's like, oh wow, they're in isolation and they're like grappling with the fact that they're in isolation and like they have more money than anyone else because obviously they are selling they're selling like their minerals to people like the vibranium or whatever, but at the same time like they're kind of isolated and they're trying to like decide whether to break out, like almost like a Saudi Arabia type deal where they're like trying to decide whether or not to like liberalize, I guess, and open themselves up to like the rest of the world in that way, not in like a way that would actually help out anyone that's actually living there, but like in an economic way, like the economic system. Like, should we stay isolated or should we like open ourselves up? You know what I mean? Like, so the end of the movie is literally like, oh well, you know what? We've decided we're gonna like neoliberalize, but like the worst of both worlds. Like we're gonna open up an office that like would like give us maybe status in the UN.
Well, I mean, to look at it.
And they do have status in the UN in like they show you that like in Captain America Civil War, they have status in the UN by that that point.
So it's my response to that reading is complicated because you basically are left with two reactionary visions. One is an isolationist super kingdom that can somehow stay secret in the world. And from all stances of economics, even with vibranium would not be viable.
Well, they have one big contractor that they're selling to,
right?
And somehow that's keeping them afloat. Which, when you really think about it, Stark Industries is their like one contractor, so it's the U.S. military. So they're selling vibranium to the U.S. military. And then we're kind of assuming that like the U.S. military doesn't know where their force field is, but they're also
so you're making a good argument that Wakanda is Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, like reactionary kingdom that continues to exist because it has one commodity that it can sell. I mean, it doesn't do some of the other like weird labor practices and but then again,
we never really see that part.
We don't really understand how its economy could possibly work, actually. So
yeah, but like they never really get into the economics of it. They never really get into like you don't really see that much of that part of it. You know what I mean? You see the ruling family in a similar way to like, you know, we hear a lot about like MBS and we don't hear a lot about like, you know what I mean? Like a lot about like, I mean, you hear about people on the ground in Saudi Arabia, but like that's kind of their focus. That's their like, it's almost like you're watching a PR campaign. It's like, look at this dynamic new leader that's deciding he's a superhero and he's deciding whether or not they should neoliberalize. And you know what? He might do it. He might do it. He might let the CIA in, because African countries always benefit from letting the CIA in.
Right.
You can totally trust the CIA.
I mean, I guess the good side is because of vibranium, they won't have to take a loan from the IMF. But it's such a fantasy land, and the geopolitics of Marvel movies make it that way. But Marvel movies, as we've said, can never make sense because they're marketed to so many different groups. They don't want to offend anybody. Even they don't even want to have to edit it heavily for like Middle Eastern audiences. If you've ever gone to the movie theater in the Middle East, which I doubt you have, but I have, and everything is chopped. Everything is chopped to. It's chopped up. It's just, you know, it's censored, and it's censored obviously.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd assume probably, you know, like the Chinese government or any other, like, you know, any government that like is in international markets, but also like, you know, has a more censorious approach, I guess, to Hollywood cinema. Like, I would assume that there comes a point where if you push things too far, they can't censor it anymore, and they just, you know, because you hear about that all the time with Disney movies and like other big movies in the CCP. They're like, at some point, like they're just like, you know what, we can't cut this up anymore. Like this can't enter the market.
Right.
Which I mean, the thing is though, like making that point, like, you know, if you do that too much to the US, it's not like we're any different. Like you just won't get your movie funded.
Right. I mean, we don't censor stuff. We just won't fund it.
Yeah. I was watching the Heart of Darkness documentary about Apocalypse Now the other night, because we're doing Tropic Thunder tomorrow for Movie Night Extravaganza with like the Left Flank Vets. So I was rewatching the Heart of Darkness documentary where they ended up going to the Philippines, Coppola, because you know, the U.S. military just wouldn't fund Apocalypse Now. They're like, yeah, get the fuck out of here. So he gave like a bunch of his own raised money and his friends' money to like Marcos in the Philippines, just to be, and then borrowed a bunch of fucking military equipment.
It's kind of amazing how the DoD has so much control over what we do. I mean, I think that's partially why we haven't gotten a good, like, we don't have the same kind of sentiment that's going to come out of like the Iraq War and the War on Terror that we did in the boomer 70s and 80s, you know, auteur period from Coppola to early Oliver Stone, because the DoD itself is way too involved. So the most critique you could possibly do of the military is going to be something like, I don't know, Zero Dark 30, which is really a celebration of it. And so that is why I think we don't have that, because people have asked, like, why don't we have films coming out of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars like we do from the Vietnam Wars? The Iraq and Afghanistan wars are longer. We still lost them. It's hard to say what we did. Like, yeah, we lost them, but like we didn't even lose them. Like, we had no mission after the initial one in the first place. Like, the best you can get
I think it's important to note that like wars don't end anymore. So that's another reason why, I mean, since Vietnam, like wars don't end anymore. Like we don't end our occupation of a country. You know what I mean? Like there's like, even when a war ends, like there's still troops on the ground, like in Iraq. So it's like, you know, these movies that like maybe, you know, the Vietnam War kind of ended, quote unquote, and you know, there was a small period of time where those movies could slip through. It did take like a decade, but like there was a small period of time where like, you know, distrust for the American military, the American government had gotten, like it kind of pushed things out a little bit. And I mean, the movies kind of snuck around and got like sketchier funding sources. But like, I think that like it's not going to happen anymore because like there's never going to be a moment where the U.S. military leaves its guard down like that again.
Well, I think there's a whole lot. I mean, Afghanistan's obviously over, and I maybe I'm not so sanguine on the U.S. military's expansionist possibilities anytime real soon, despite its massive capacity. Our opponents have nuclear weapons. It's hard to bully people around when they also have the same weapons you do. But
you also have someone that, I mean, you have another country that can legitimately, economically at least, compete with the U.S. that it obviously isn't pushing for a war. Although a lot of people here are pushing for a war, like are smart enough not to be pushing for a war, but also have some kind of economic leverage that the USSR never had whatsoever. So they couldn't even get blue jeans and whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like.
What you get now is the most meaningful commentary on the Iraq War is probably going to come out of speculative fiction shows from 10 years ago, like Battlestar Galactica, which is not even a particularly coherent show, but at least has something to say specifically about the Iraq War. And that has been what's been leading for a while, this whole shift from prestige film to prestige television, but that's over too. Right, like prestige television is no longer like it's no longer that distinctive.
It began and ended with The Sopranos.
I mean, to me, you have like 3 shows that really exemplified it actually, and they all came out before we were really talking about what prestige television was. That's Sopranos, The Wire, The Shield. Like,
I put Breaking Bad in there too.
Yeah, Breaking Bad. But Breaking Bad goes furthest into the period where people started talking about prestige TV as prestige TV.
Breaking Bad is also I love that it's basically a case for why like we need Medicare for all. Like if you really read into the fact that Walter White's original, like you can argue that like it's always in him the inherent evil to push all moral boundaries aside and turn into like this drug kingpin, drug manufacturing monster. Like you could argue that, but the thing that pushes him into it is not being able to pay medical bills.
Right.
And there's all the complicated feelings that go along with that, like his own feelings of failure and his own self-destructive qualities throughout his life. But like the thing that pushes him into it is still not being able to pay massive medical bills and like wanting to stay alive and being like, hey, maybe I shouldn't. Which is ironic, obviously, that he's getting involved in a thing that could very easily get him killed, but like, and like is not wanting to die from cancer. Like he'll get riddled full of bullets or something if he has to, but he doesn't want to die from the cancer. And then he's like, you know what? It's time.
One of the things I would say about, this brings us back to our topic though. You and I have discussed a lot of Alex Cox movies, and I would say, and again, this has become, there's a weird sort of red cream race about this with the streaming platforms, because Netflix and Amazon used to have tons of really interesting independent cinema on it. They've been weeding it out, making it harder to submit, but their competitors, Tubi and their downstream competitors, are now picking up the slack to get content so then they can do the same thing. So you're gonna have this kind of rat race, particularly now that everybody has their own streaming platform.
Which kind of sucks that you have to pay for all this fucking streaming platforms.
Well, it's this, you see, and obviously I don't pay for a lot of them, but what you see is the same thing that that you see in every other aspect of multimedia consumption these days, is hyper nichization. Like I mean, we're a podcast. You can't get more niche, but but there is this
left independent media, not even
independent media, yeah. So you can't get more niche than that, and what you have is this, you have basically the replication of cable packages, but now very specific. It's what libertarians actually wanted 10 years ago, which was like, I can pick a la carte which channels I want and just buy it. And now I'm like, yeah, but you didn't think about what that would mean when every channel tried to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing that they talk about with like medical services. Like they're like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could just decide what medical procedures we wanted and get rid of the other charges? And it's like, yeah, but like when every organ fails at once, then you're paying for stuff for every organ. Like that doesn't work the way you think it's going to work.
Well, I would say that in the United States, on the medical front, we have the worst system on the planet, and there's literally, it doesn't even work like a normal market. So it is sort of the worst of all worlds because there's no price point either.
Well, it's I mean, it comes from a bill that the medical insurance companies wrote themselves, and then Obama was like, wouldn't it be great if we had this? And it's literally like a shining example of like, medical companies being able to like write their own laws, and then like, what I mean, like insurance companies literally writing the insurance system and going, listen, these are the things that we want, try to shoehorn them in through the ACA. And I mean, it's nice that like, I mean, I have Medicaid, so you know what I mean? Like I can't, I'm benefiting, I guess, in some small way from that system, but like not really, like, you know what I mean? Like not in the sense of like overall, like our entire, our medical system fucking sucks.
Right. Well, one of the things this brings me to, maybe to talk a little bit about, and then we'll pivot back into movies, but like the ease of making media now across the board is the easiest it's ever been. When I started doing media, I was in college radio in like the early 2000s. I couldn't do it independently. There'd be no way you could have that equipment. Like it would have cost you $50,000-$60,000.
You're getting involved with like a public radio station, like if you can, like, you know what I mean? Like, or like,
I mean, although I was thinking about like how movies like Pump Up the Volume don't work anymore because like, oh, it'd be really easy to do it, but like, who cares if you start our podcast? But so there is a way in which we have more content to watch than ever. The people who make it often don't benefit from it. And we've only found a way to benefit from it by having a platform that will allow people to make micropayments to us in aggregate.
And then it's the same thing with like every single channel having a, you know what I mean? Like having a subsystem of their own, or like a payment system of their own.
Oh, yeah.
You're now competing with like 15 different other,
well, even in the Emancipation Network, where we have, since we don't have a master stream and we don't have a master Patreon, just to subscribe, I think if you wanted full access to all Emancipation Network podcasts, it would probably be about $60 US a month. Like to subscribe to all of them, Swamp Side, GIU, From Alpha to Omega, Varn Blog, and almost every network's like that. And then you think about that there's also independent shows, and so there's like no way to support everybody you want to support. And it's a very weird model what we do too. I mean, like right now, for example, I basically put all my effort into making shows so that people will support me for shows. It's basically the stuff that I would put on the DVD extras if we were in the 90s. Like, so the point of that just is like, we've seen this niche marketization across the board. In some ways it is good for creatives, except now creatives have no money. Yeah. I mean, when you hear about the kind of money that they were giving to some of these auteurs in the 70s, you're and also when you start adjusting for inflation, your jaw just drops. You're like, so the studio system failed. They had tons of money. People needed material, so they were just throwing it at people and letting them make interesting art, but with questionable ethics of making it, and like with no real price controls, which is kind of questionable.
I mean, we talked about we did that long stream on Halloween last night, and like part of my research into like how Halloween was made was like John Carpenter kind of went to a bunch of producers that he was like friends with, but one of the producers was I forget the guy's name, but he had worked with the Libyan government for a really long time, and like his own personal movies that he directed were all funded by Gaddafi, like The Message, that movie. He was making like these desert epics, like these that like pro I mean, not necessarily pro Libyan, because he's not like, but like that, like like the Libyan government was funding these movies that he was making, and like I don't know, like sources like that, you know what I mean, like that are like trying to get into like American cinema as like an art form, and trying to make a quick buck that way, because you really could in the 70s. Like you could just kind of make like exploitation film and be like, you know what, like I made a good amount of money, like art house cinemas grabbed it, or like, we got into theaters somewhere, like we funded it, like we have connections somewhere, like.
Well, what's interesting about this for me is to think about this in terms of media landscape, right? It has killed stuff like the gatekeepers. Like Alex Cox can get a movie made if he wanted to now, whereas after Nicaragua Gate for Alex Cox, it was impossible for him to make a movie without a ton of footage, and he couldn't do it through any like big Hollywood studios or even downstream from that for a long time. Probably still can't, but but he's made movies independently since then, because it's a lot easier to do. So on one hand, we have more of that, but on the other hand, it's hard as hell to find out about it.
Yeah.
Like,
unless it's entered in like a film festival, which has its own gatekeepers that aren't necessarily the same gatekeepers that are, that exist right now in theaters, like, or like in big theaters, you know what I mean? Like, or in, all of these distribution, like, companies, but like it still has its own, there still are its own gatekeepers. And there's still so many film festivals that, like, how do you really find out about that many of them? You know what I mean? Like,
I was about to say, like, yeah, if you're not in Sundance or South by Southwest, there's 1,000 film festivals, and but where are people going to see it? Like there's so many film festivals that I don't always know what's going on with them. I know that people go there to scout for, like, to get basically material for things like Tubi or back in the day Amazon Prime, but even that's going to be really limited. I mean, I've heard the returns on some of those, like they're not even breaking even anymore. It's usually a money losing proposition to even make a small film.
Yeah. And I mean, you have stuff like A24 that you can kind of submit stuff to, or you have like Blumhouse that did the new Halloween, like, like that aren't necessarily doing, like, that aren't necessarily trying to get movies from the same directors that like big Hollywood studios are, but it's still kind of a very small selection that they're actually going to go with.
So what's interesting about that, though, as you think about it, we've regressed in the way we actually distribute movies, because the distribution chains are a lot more like the early theater days.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, you would have art house movies in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and you'd have like B movies to tack onto a drive-through, which thanks to COVID, that's back to happening. Mm-hmm. And so what you have now is you have Blumhouse basically producing quality but B movies. That's what they would have been in an earlier market. And you have art house cinema being produced by A4. And then you also have foreign films also filling that niche, which they've always done, actually. So you're in this really kind of strange place where we develop these master distribution chains just to break them back down so everything actually works, like an even lower profit margin version of how we started. I mean, it's similar to literature. Like, we think about the heyday of like the writers, where you could live as a writer. That's actually a very small period of time between like the 1950s to the 1980s.
Yeah.
The advent of the mass market paperback period. And
at the time, what kind of money was flooding in from like the economy, like kind of working for like a small, like a bigger population than it did for before and after that.
Right. And so, but it's basically during the waves of largesse that you still had after the post-war social contract.
Yeah.
And that's actually
some middle class workers finally had time to read.
Right. and they were producing books for cheap enough that you could buy them and then they'd be disposable. I remember when mass market paperbacks were $2, which admittedly is like $7 now, but still, it's an interesting problem to have, where you have all these highly controlled distribution chains, but there's so many of them, the constant content, and it's easy to get lost. So what I do for fun is to watch a lot of horror and sci-fi movies that are like on Shudder, on, not on the top 10 of Netflix, but on the next run down. And I find a lot of really good, interesting films through doing that, and a lot of good foreign films through doing that. But I have to make an active effort to do so. And I guess that's somewhat similar to back in the day, like in the 80s when you had even major movie studios like producing like Alex Cox movies, but you kind of had to find them and find a place to see them, or find a place to find the VHS. They weren't usually easy to do. VHSs weren't largely produced.
That's kind of also where you got kind of different scenes, right? Like, like the punk scene had, their own directors, like people that kind of hung around that, like different music scenes or different art scenes would kind of pass stuff around between them, which was an interesting marketing strategy, I think, for but like would never get outside of those groups unless you had someone from like a major distribution thing making it easy to access them, which of course they wouldn't have.
But what was also interesting is what you saw in these time periods was the distribution chains really break down. So the reason why the auteur thing happens in the 70s is the studio system completely falls apart.
Yeah.
The reason why you have an interesting set of movies in the late 90s through the early aughts is actually because the blockbusters stopped bringing in as much money, and there was a consolidation of movie theaters. I think we will actually, as bad as I think the movies the last few years were, I think we're actually probably going to look at this time and from like last year onto the next few years as a similar time period, because like Disney and all them have to change their model. Like they cannot rely on the seats and the seats in the movies all over the world model right now, and they know it. That's why so many properties are getting moved to Disney Plus, or getting expanded out to prestige, in quotations, TV, etc. But I think this is going to leave us in an interesting place for like actual independent cinema, like an uneven filmmaker who's very interesting, and we both like Alex Cox, who basically kind of got all of his other movies backed off of two, Repo Man and Sid and Nancy.
He was the sacrificial lamb, kind of, right? Like the Reagan era's sacrificial, like, filmmaker.
Right.
That after kind of bursting on the scene after Repo Man was like the newest director, kind of was very publicly kicked out of and blacklisted from Hollywood. Like they were kind of making the point that they could still do that, which is kind of a power grab for them, because things had fallen apart to the point where they were like, listen, we need to, number one, it's pissed off a moment where you can't really make anything that's not at its core patriotic. Like there's a lot of, like Verhoeven was making movies at that point, but like, there really isn't much that you can really like point to and be like, people want to see this. Like they decided people wanted to see more optimistic stuff. They decided people wanted to see, like the comedy has to either be absurdist or like, the jokes have to be like slipped in about political issues. Like I talked about that with Jay Underworld. Like I was on Bad Takes, like, and we watched Tape Heads, and like everything kind of had to be absurdist, and like, if you were gonna slip like any kind of political messaging into it, or so like you also had that like strain of like, oh, corporate greed is bad, but it never really went into like how to fix it. It's just like, isn't it bad that we have so much corporate greed now? As
isn't
plots
that true of like anti-capitalist cinema right now?
Yeah, but so I'm saying like, but I'm saying that moment specifically for Alex Cox, he kind of becomes this like sacrificial lamb that they're like, this has gone too far, and we're gonna very publicly shun you to scare other leftist filmmakers from showing anything like that. And they've done it to Oliver Stone too, to some degree. I mean, throughout his career, a bunch of times.
I mean, to a certain degree, yes. Although Oliver Stone is pretty good at shooting himself in the foot.
Yeah,
but I will not push back on that. I just want to complicate it a little bit. You could have been a leftist filmmaker in the art house scene at any time in the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's been the one place it's been safe to go, because interestingly, and I don't think this is deliberate, but it's something that I find fascinating. Leftist cinema is okay in popular culture if it is aimed at snobby rich people.
Yeah. I mean, it's the like, populist streak, I guess. Right. Anti-elite streak that kind of goes into like the American mind a lot.
Like when you think about, so I think it's interesting you bring up like Oliver Stone, who I think his penchant for playing with conspiracy theories aside, and his love of Russia aside.
Well, one very particular Russian, anyway.
Yeah.
But probably the worst one to have an
right.
unironic love for.
But one thing I would I've seen people telling me that Joker is subversive, and I think it's funny. Joker is subversive because it's copying movies from the 70s that were actually subversive. It has no actual subversive content to it. The director doesn't really know what he wants to make. Sorry to bother you.
The thing is that Scorsese agreed to come on as a producer for Joker, and then backed out of it very fast and was like, "Oh, sorry, I don't have time for this." So they wrote a Scorsese movie, and then Scorsese was like, "Yeah, I've made this movie already. Like, I'm doing." Yeah,
it's the Kings of Comedy and Taxi Driver made into one movie.
Yeah,
like,
and they're like, "We're still gonna make a Scorsese movie, a '70s Scorsese."
So one of the things I find interesting about all that is that we have had interesting anti-capitalist cinema in the last. We have Parasite. You have Started to Bother You.
Snowpiercer, I think was
Snowpiercer.
But even then, I mean, we watched all those Bong Joon-ho interviews. He's just very good at the tap dance of getting around. He puts his thoughts into the film, and then he's kind of very good at getting around actually talking about them as a director, which I think would isolate him from audiences that have by necessity embraced his filmmaking.
Yeah, well, I think it would isolate him from also. I mean, I think that's not just for the U.S. audience that he's tapping around; it's also for the Korean one.
Yeah. Well, no, he's like, there's a clip that we didn't watch where he's talking to. He gets honored by President Moon, and he's like pretty deferential. He's like, "Wow, I can't believe I'm sitting next to the president. Like, this is amazing." Not that he wouldn't have maybe supported Moon versus the more conservative, South Korean candidate that was like far more U.S. backed at the time, but like I think that like still like he knows how to flatter his audience so that he doesn't really get into trouble, and then puts his thoughts into the film itself.
But again, we find parallels to that in like Kubrick, who the hell knows what Kubrick's actual politics really were?
Yeah,
I mean we do know, but like you can't get it from his films. Actually,
I could argue probably that Kubrick, might not have actually had politics in some ways, like in the sense that like he would get fixated on a subject, and then he would do all the research possible into that subject. I mean, he's definitely anti-war, like. He made enough anti-war films for that to be the case. Like someone mentioned Paths of Glory in the in the chat, like, which is an amazing movie. But like, so he's definitely anti-war. He's definitely anti-nuclear proliferation. But like, besides that, like he doesn't seem. I mean, there seems to be a populism to it, but like there isn't like a. Who knows if
it's a populism to it, but he also hates people.
Yeah.
Like so. I mean, I think. I think
the populism is more, I think, anti-elitist than it is.
Yeah, it's anti-elitist because that's the people that he knows and he hates them.
I do like that he would force all of the people that he hated because he hated actors. He hated Hollywood type people, so he'd force them to come all the way to England to be around him, and then he kind of torture them for a certain amount of time and then send them back. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like he could, like, it's not even like he I don't know. He's bringing the people that he hates to him, giving them like a nice little torture session, and then being like, all right, go back. I'm not ever going to see you again. Go back to the U.S. and, you know, rot.
One of the things I find interesting about leftist political commentary, because the other thing I'm going to tell people deliberately to offend my audience right now, most leftist political analyzations of movies are midwit, pedantic, and lazy. Which I'm not going to name out specific writers at Jacobin, but I've read writers that are basically like, this is really good, but only if it talked about liberation and socialism would it truly meet it. And I'm just,
I mean, I don't work at Jacobin anymore, so you can.
Well, it's not all criticism at Jacobin's like this. Actually, their two major film critics don't do this right now, but they've had people in the past that I've made fun of, who I don't even think are leftists anymore. But I'm not going to go into that. So you would see that strain of popular criticism, and you'd see this strain of also like trying to glom on to very big neoliberal movies and make them about some issue that we care about, which of course they're going to kind of be, because neoliberal movies still have to reflect the society that they're marketing to. Like, there's no way.
Nomadland is a perfect neoliberal and like liberal humanist movie, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like not at any point being like offending Amazon because they want to film in Amazon fulfillment centers. I mean, presumably that's the reason. You know what I mean? Like, but also kind of, you know, oh, we care about homelessness. We care about humanizing. Like, we care about empathy. We care about humanizing, like, the human spirit. But it's like there's no strategy. Like, there's no like at the end of it, you don't leave the movie feeling like you've learned anything about what we should do about the like homelessness crisis, or like how we could economically empower people. Just
right.
Like, oh, well, I hope I hope that like, Amazon pays them more next time.
we don't even learn. Right. We don't even learn negatively. Like, we don't even get a full negative picture to go like, okay, well, we don't know how to fix it, but we know we hate that guy. Like,
yeah.
Which, admittedly, like movies like Network and stuff in the 70s did at least know to tell you who to hate. But I find this period sort of interesting because I think another thing that we have right now is there's more movie commentary than there is movies. I mean, you and I are both guilty of it. I go on your show. But I know people who will listen to movie podcasts for movies they don't watch. Like, ever. Now, that baffles me. Unless it's a very terrible movie. But honestly, I usually go and watch those because I like... My personal taste spectrum is... to make a bad joke, it is what some people might call a red-brown alliance. It is very trashy, low art, even somewhat reactionary movies. The kind of stuff that gets on bad takes. And why does this get made? You know, those kind of movies. And then, you know, my other taste is high art. You know, and there's a lot of people like that. I think it's a pretty common actual spectrum of taste. Particularly when you feel alienated by like, man, Marvel movies are like candy. Like a little bit tastes pretty good. A lot of it, I'm now sick and my teeth are rotting, and I'm a lot dumber than I was when I started.
Yeah. I mean, I watched. I mean, I didn't catch all of them, but I watched up until like Endgame, and then I was like, I don't know. I never really want to see one of these again. Like I've had my fill of it. I know too many characters now. Like, you know what I mean? Like not just like, I mean, obviously I always do like the main, you know, superheroes that the movies are based off of, but like there's just so many characters at some point. You're like, all right, I know so many Marvel characters now. Like, I don't need to know anymore. I never want to learn anymore. I don't care what happens to any of these people.
And so, yeah, I mean, and also at this point, you're like, why am I not just watching television? Like, if it's this episode. In fact, I feel like actually now the long form storytelling has moved to television, and most film is episodic. it's like the 1930s, actually. Like literally, which is also interesting, was the last time we had like long superhero movies, right? Like the serial, and we talk about them as the 30 serials, like the nickel serials. It's a very similar kind of movie making, except this costs a lot more money to make.
Yeah. I don't know. And this is kind of, I mean, I think that a little bit before like the Hays Code came around, there was a little bit more freedom for like the first few decades of filmmaking. There's a little bit more freedom of what you can make. Although they're still kind of discovering like, oh, wow, we could do this with movies and have like, you know, like, so that's an interesting time that ends up kind of very quickly becoming like a, you know, because of the Cold War and because of moralistic, you know, interpretations of things, I guess, becomes like a, you know, then you can't really make anything that isn't within a very small parameter.
Well, yeah,
and then it opens back up again at the end of like the studio system falls apart and it opens back up again. But it's like,
right. It's actually really interesting to watch pre-Hays Code movies from the 30s if you can get them. Like, because
it's interesting to watch silent movies really when you can get them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Because they're way more interesting and kind of salacious than you thought they were gonna be.
Yeah.
It was. I went through this period. I teach a film course to high school students every couple of years. And I went back and showed them like a lot of these early silent movies, Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, and even the kind of quasi-fash ones like Intolerance. I say, you know, don't get mad at us for making Birth of a Nation, people. You're not tolerant enough. But actually, what's interesting about Intolerance is part of that movie is actually pretty good. But it's watching those early pre-Hays Code movies, and you're just like, whoa, they were a lot more interesting than we give them credit for. I don't know why I didn't know more about this.
Well, Birth of a Nation even kind of cemented D.W. Griffith as like, you know, like the prestige filmmaker of his time. Like nobody had made anything to that level. Like, I mean, it's literally like it's a lost cause, you know, fucking train wreck. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and deeply racist and kind of single-handedly kind of invented certain parts of like the way that Southerners were, you know, dressing as the KKK, like all of that. But like, you know, still he was considered like, you know, even decades later, like Sunset Boulevard, we just watched for a stream. And even in Sunset Boulevard, they're like, oh, there are only 3 directors at that time. And like, you know, one of them was D.W. Griffith. And then, you know, like he's kind of the top of the line. You don't really have that many options, I guess, but still.
Yeah, well, you think about how crazy ambitious Intolerance is, where it's like in 4 different timelines, and like, it's a crazy sort of deal, and it's really interesting to see these time periods where things break down. I think Verhoeven's another. You mentioned Verhoeven earlier. Verhoeven is my favorite popular artist because he somehow captures the spirit of high art in a totally low art format.
Yeah.
And you realize that he kind of, I didn't realize that he has the ability, without even completely understanding a culture, to watch a culture's films, mimic them, and satirize something essential about that culture. And I say that because it's not, he didn't just do it with America. He's also done it with French cinema. If you've seen Elle.
I haven't.
Elle is like a takedown of the French erotic thriller. Like a perfect takedown, but you have to know French erotic thrillers to really get what it's doing. It redeemed Showgirls for me. I went back and watched Showgirls, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, I get what this is doing now. This is making fun of our stupid erotic thrillers. So Verhoeven is amazing like that. And he also pretty much gets sacrificed after Starship Troopers.
Yeah, he makes one more movie right after that, and then
he only makes movies in Europe now.
Yeah, right? But no, he makes one more movie after Starship Troopers in the U.S.
Right.
It's the I can't remember if it's The Invisible Man or something like that. Wait, hold on. I mean, keep going. I'm just gonna look up.
Because like Starship Troopers and Showgirls were held against him.
Hollow Man.
Hollow Man. Yeah, Hollow Man. Yeah. But Hollow Man is an Invisible Man movie. And again, I was also playing with tropes.
And
But
it didn't do very well, and he kind of just was like, all right, I like got sacrificed, but also like kind of didn't want to be in the US anymore. Whatsoever.
Yeah. And so it's an interesting sort of deal that you have there with Verhoeven. Because he was sneaking that stuff in, and I don't think people caught how much satire was in it most of the time.
Yeah, and everything was ahead of the time, like it's the curve enough that people weren't catching on to it when the movie actually came out. Like Starship Troopers, Starship Troopers is done during the Clinton administration. Like it's not done during the Bush administration when like this kind of like insane militarization is actually like you'd think we'd be talking about that during the Bush administration. He does it like a few years earlier than even that. Like no one saw that coming whatsoever besides Verhoeven.
Right. Well, what's interesting? Well, I don't know about that. But nobody was talking about it in popular culture.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like movie wise, like cinema audiences and cinema critics weren't expecting something like that to be happening that early on.
But you think about all of our good sort of like politically aware, popular versus high art. I can think of and I love high art directors. My favorite director is Tarkovsky. Like I'm just as pretentious as you think I'd be, but I love movies like The Thing and watching Ebert, who I don't actually think is a bad critic, tear Carpenter apart for that movie being like masculine trash, and I'm like, but it's exploring a ton of things.
They're weird. They were a weird bellwether, like of, because I feel like there are times where their politics on like Siskel and Ebert or like it was kind of reactionary, and they're like, oh, we don't get this for this reason. Like Starship Troopers is a good example of that. Like I remember reading there, like they're like, oh, we don't really get this. Like this doesn't make any sense to us. Like the politics of it don't make sense to them. And then there are other times where like, no, we're woke now. Like this is masculine trash.
But what was interesting about Carpenter, if you know anything about Carpenter's politics, I mean, yeah, Kurt Russell is a reactionary, and Carpenter would and they're good friends, and Carpenter would, say that Russell was to the right of Attila the Hun, but Carpenter's a lefty, like, and he pretty much got rolled out of Hollywood on a rail by the end of the 90s, like,
well, I mean, but he mocks like Big Trouble in Little China. He mocks Kurt Russell like that. Mm-hmm. Kurt Russell's character is just an idiot, and he's like, "Hey, I'm going to make Kurt Russell play an idiot. He's going to play John Wayne and Kurt Russell being an idiot, and like in a we're just going to throw him into basically like a Chinese like a Chinese martial arts movie, and we're just going to have him kind of bungle his way through it." And
so, having watched a whole lot of cinema and talked about it in depth for 4 months, what are you seeing emerging as cultural trends about U.S. cinema, particularly if you jump from time periods? Because I've watched a lot of 50s, 60s, and 70s cinema for you, but I also know you are dealing with modern stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the like cultural trends kind of are very fleeting in a lot of stuff. Like I think that, what Pascal calls like the 50-year counter-revolution is a very real thing. And not only in the sense of like movies have gotten more militaristic, because obviously they have, funding has gotten more militaristic, obviously it has, for the movies to even get made, but like at the same time, like the more liberal side of it is saying less. Like there was a time when liberal filmmaking in the 50s and 60s or 40s and 50s were union based a lot of the time. They were like good labor movies, at least they were giving, like, you know what I mean, like I wouldn't say like the majority of it. There's also at the same time like a super reactionary liberal Cold War cinema. You know what I mean? But like, the audiences that they're talking to, it gets smaller and smaller. It gets more, I mean, as we're saying, like workshopped, things aren't really saying very much a lot of the time. And then also you have, if you know how to find it, you have stuff that's getting better. But like, I don't know. I think that, there's the cultural trends in cinema are kind of the same as anywhere else. I think that, they mirror, like, I don't think cinema a lot of the time is ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, this is why I find a lot of the way we talk about cinema and cinema leadership somewhat, and also in television too, backwards, because when people are like, oh well, you know, Greg and Dharma and Greg and what's that other show that everyone says ended homophobia?
Will and Grace.
Will and Grace, yeah, not Dharma and Greg. Will and Grace, and then Ellen coming out was these big cultural touchstone moments that changed the way America felt about gay people, and I'm like, I think it's the other way around.
Yeah,
actually, like I think things were changing about that, and then seeing it on television reinforced that. But the culture was being reflected back to us. Like, yeah. Like I've always thought,
and it's the same thing with that article that came out the other day that everyone was roasting, where that one writer was like, oh, I wasn't, like, she was an Asian woman, and she was like, oh, I wasn't attracted to Asian men until I saw Korean dramas. Did you see that article that everybody was like just trashing on Twitter the other day? Yeah, it's like I think critics are like, oh well, really, like culture is leading us, because they're fixated on it all the time. They're writing about it, they're thinking about it, like, oh, culture is leading us. Culture is never leading us. Like, what's happening is reflected back to us as a mirror. And I think that the best thing that really, I mean, movies can really do is they can be a really good mirror. Like, it could be like certain cultural trends that are good can be reflected back to us in a way that, like, people that maybe aren't thinking about those ideas are something like, oh, but like, it's not inventing those ideas. It never will be.
Right. I mean, and so that's why I find this whole dialogue about culture somewhat, you know, strange. I'm like, no, you change the culture, and to change the culture, you have to change more than culture. And the movies will change towards that, not the other way around. I mean, if you make a movie that's super progressive, I mean, and there are movies that are truly ahead of the curve, they don't get marketed that much. You don't find out about them usually for like 10, 15 years when they're not ahead of the curve anymore. Like,
the interesting thing that with like the 40s and 50s cinema, for a very brief moment, and like labor cinema, is like, for the first time really ever. I mean, of course there were things that were incredibly bad doing this as well, but there are moments where like there's union filmmaking for like the first time. Like, you know what I mean? Films about unions. They're like, wow, you should join a union. Like, there's a bunch of them that get made. Like, FDR understood to like make the New Deal work, he had to make a bunch of like government made films. Like, you know what I mean? Like, for really the only time I think in our history, like the aims of the government were positive enough that there's like interesting movies that you're not like, oh wow, this is incredibly reactionary trash. Now, like, because the military is taking control of that side of it, it's all incredibly reactionary trash when it is something that is directly corresponding with the U.S. system.
Right, and most of the time it's just not. I mean, it's just nothing. Like, there's no political content there. And like I said, I don't think it's just the DoD that's driving that. I do think that's a lot of it, but I also think the fact that it has to be anodyne in like 5 different world markets and actually do well because of all these, you know, deals, it actually really does limit the efficacy of movie to have a message, because messages require context. And if you don't have that, then you normally have to rely on archetypes and tropes, which is what most comic book writing is. That's why that's been a primary IP generator for the last like decade, I think.
Yeah,
2 decades, really.
I'm sure J. Andrew World would have all kinds of you know, comics are actually leading the curve comments to make here, but
I mean, their comics are like any other form of art, and I think, like, yeah, there's tons of great comics, but just like with movies, there's still, when we say there's no good movies, that's not true. There's you could still, by the way, even now, if you knew how to find it and you did sleuthing, you could only ever watch good movies. Like, you don't really ever have to watch a bad movie, guys. I subject myself to bad movies to understand the culture, but like,
yeah.
You don't.
Well, I mean, but you could also have a lot of good cinema that's not necessarily like progressive. Like, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah. I think a lot of good cinema isn't, honestly. Like,
yeah. I gotta run to the bathroom really quick. I have to pee so bad.
All right.
I'll be right back in 1 second. It's literally like just the door right there.
All right. So Yeah, I'm gonna talk about this a little bit. Someone in the chat says, in some ways, the Hays Code was less restrictive than the existing in the world market. Yes, I think that's actually interesting. One thing that we've learned from markets is if you're trying to make something that appeases everybody, you can very much make something that really, honestly, doesn't have anything to say. And so there you go. I think the idea that there's no good movies being made is just not true. It's just they're not making it into theaters. But then why does that matter to you anymore anyway? Yeah, that's probably fair. So, someone in chat says, if you hang out with your family, you're going to watch bad movies. Oh, well, not at my house, but if I hang out with my parents, probably. Although I'll also tell them their taste is bad. So
yeah, the good movies point. You could definitely watch good movies that have nothing to do with politics forever, like if you wanted to, like,
right,
and just not know anything happening culturally. Really, like, I don't know. I think the Will and Grace thing is interesting because I think that it was never going to be ahead of the curve, but like Norman Lear's style of sitcoms have influenced the way that sitcoms have been written since then, like including Will and Grace, including everything else. Like, you know what I mean? Like All in the Family, like it kind of embodied like we're going to have a bunch of characters in conflict with our current culture and they're all going to kind of be arguing it out. And then at the end of the episode, like nothing's really going to change, but like, look, we've shown all sides of this argument.
Right.
And
it's going to seem super interesting to watch it. Right.
Yeah.
What's interesting is, I mean, I remember when people were talking about Modern Family as like, oh, the sitcoms are about something again. I'm like, no, they've always been that. Like, you always take a trope of each type of person that exists in the predominant cultural zeitgeist. You sit them down and you write dialogue about how they interact, and nothing's ever really resolved. People only grow for one episode and then immediately regress.
Yeah.
And
well, because there's going to be another issue that comes up, next week that, they're not going to all of a sudden be non-reactionary on every level. They're back to being fully reactionary again. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, I think All in the Family kind of backfired on what Norman Lear was trying to do, because all of a sudden conservatives still see themselves in Archie Bunker. Like conservatives, like, because Norman Lear was a liberal, like, to the in like the 70s kind of way, you know what I mean? Like kind of making a cinema, like maybe trying to shift
before the Aaron Sorkin types were super obnoxious.
Yeah. But then like conservatives would start like watching Archie Bunker and go, you know what? He's making a good point. Like,
but isn't that been the problem? I mean, we talked about this with war movies, and the chat's been talking about this with war movies now for an hour. But like, it is very hard to make an anti-war movie that is about the war, set in the war. There are some movies that have done it. Most of the ones that I can think of are Russian, and maybe Paths of Glory, and then a couple of there's a couple of good, but most of the really
Paths of Glory is great. But I think for reasons that like anti-war movies, if they were about our war now, like wars now, like couldn't be like
right.
You know what I mean? Like,
well, I mean it's one thing about war movies. They usually have to set it in the last war to say anything about the current one. So like MASH is set in Korea, but it's about Vietnam, etc. But what I'm saying about this even more so as far as anti-war movies go, it's the same thing as the Archie Bunker problem. It's the Scorsese movie problem. Scorsese is critiquing everything he makes a movie of almost inevitably, but he makes it so damn well and sympathetic that everyone kind of sympathizes with the bad guy. And you can think of like this in both his Wall Street movies, both Wall Street and Wolf of Wall Street. People end up, like quoting Gordon Gekko unironically. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with like even Full Metal Jacket, this got brought up in chat too, gets fully recuperated by warmongers. And that's
no, there was an interesting thing is the guy that wrote Jarheads, I remember wrote an op-ed at one point, and I read it for our GTA episode where we talked about Full Metal Jacket, where he was just like, no, every drill sergeant instructor that like I had or whatever when I was in boot camp, like would just quote Full Metal Jacket lines back to us. Like that was the character, like the Arlie Emery character. Like they were just like, oh, they wanted to embody that, which that guy fucking dies because he pushes somebody over the edge. Like, you know what I mean? Like someone that shouldn't have been pushed because like they're just trying to get anybody, you know, either like people getting drafted, like, or, you know, or people like the few people that are actually like, oh, maybe I'll go to Vietnam that are reactionary as fuck. Like some of those people are going to break. Some of those people are 100% going to break. And instead they're just like, we should keep doing this. This is a system that's working for us. I'm going to literally just embody this character that's supposed to be showing how far that like the Marine Corps pushes you.
You just see that over and over and over again in things that are satired. So that element of film almost doesn't work. Like,
yeah.
I
well,
mean,
with the All in the Family thing, what I'd say is it kind of goes from, I mean, like if you're satirizing a war, right? Like it's kind of a very specific thing. Like you can have people kind of fill into these tropes, and you're kind of making a point, and people kind of, you know, there's a lot of people that like this has to be talking about, and it's like a system more that you're satirizing more than the individuals maybe themselves. With Archie Bunker, he was a very specific kind of person that existed in a lot of fucking places. Like, you know what I mean? Like in cities across America. Like, so, you know, all of a sudden he's kind of like looked at for these like incredibly reactionary, like conservatives, like Nixon conservatives, fucking Reagan conservative, like during this era where this kind of person is like kind of flourishing because like white backlash politics are flourishing, which is dangerous because it's not just that they're talking about one issue. Like it's not like he's filling a role with one issue. He's everything. He's all political issues at once because they're handling all political issues at once.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. It's also interesting that you bring up Norman Lear and to think about I think, utter regression of a Norman Lear type to an Aaron Sorkin type. Because I don't think I can watch another Aaron Sorkin movie and not want to stab someone, like, ever.
I mean, much like Democrats always, like it's somebody writing political movies that doesn't really understand politics.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe understands politics, but like the wrong part of politics. Like look at Chicago 7, like the one that came out last year or whatever. I mean, it's incredibly boring. It's a really boring movie. Like it's a well-made movie, but it's a boring movie. And the only thing that he can really envision is like the one side of it being like Tom Hayden wanting to win elections, which, you know, his style of like the SDS is way more complicated than that. You know what I mean? Like all of the things that they were doing at once. But it's like, oh, we want to win progressive elections. And then the other side of it is like, oh, well, we want to pretend to like levitate the Pentagon on TV. Like, you know what I mean? Like, which is a real thing that like, but like, you know, his new leftist reading is like these two very small windows that you're watching them argue it out. And it's someone that doesn't really understand what he's talking about. You know what I mean? Like just kind of going based on like what he assumes would be on the page.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, there's a somewhat infamous article now that I think is totally fair. Is like, we must be afraid of everybody who got their notion of politics from the West Wing. But I mean, there is a sense in which that particular boomer triumphalist liberal narrative, which is also why we think the boomers were progressive, because by and large, if you read Rick Perlstein or whatever, you know they weren't. Like, not even as children. Like most of them were not hippies, and the hippies weren't, you know, yes, there were Maoists in Haight-Ashbury, but like that, you know, that wasn't most of the country.
That was a very small percentage of the country that didn't have any actual power or influence to do anything except like yell, "Hey, I'm a Maoist," and then
and then like give it up and then work for Hollywood or something, which is actually what ends up happening a lot of the time. And so you have this like delusional version of politics that's a self myth making that we all grew up being shoved down our throats. If you grew up in the 90s or in the early aughts, you got the boomer mythology constantly as a kid.
Yeah.
Like,
well, I mean, I think I have it worse than a lot of people, because I mean, number one, like my dad just moved there, like Woodstock, which isn't even where the actual Woodstock festival took place, but like Woodstock, the town that rejected the festival, that's like that they took its name from it, like is like, I don't know, like half an hour from me. and then I'm in like New Paltz, which is like, you know, like false like college hippie town, which, you know, so it's like that kind of boomer mythology is literally everywhere. Like there's just stores that sell tie-dye, like this, you know what I mean? Like all of the like all of the stores that are just like, I don't know, it's all like just, you know, like false neoliberal new left bullshit, like that kind of aesthetic. Nothing behind it, but like that boomer aesthetic is everywhere within this town. I literally lived above the first apartment I lived above, or second apartment I lived above was above a store called the Groovy Blueberry, that's owned by a reactionary, like Trump supporting Republican hippie, like, you know, but he like claims to be a hippie and sells tie-dye. That's what the store sells. Tie-dye, like crystals. The
number of hippies I met who were libertarians who became Trumpists from like the Southeast is pretty high. Like, I actually now I'm like, were you ever a hippie or a child of a hippie? Because that's now actually sort of like a good tell on whether or not you'll have reactionary politics.
Yeah.
And I think I do think like some people are bringing up Forrest Gump, but I think Forrest Gump, which is one of the most reactionary movies that ever got my teenage self to feel anything, because it plays your sentiment strings extremely well. And
all I've really felt about it is anger for my entire life.
Like,
I was born the year that Forrest Gump came out.
So yeah, this
4
is
kids named Forrest in my graduation.
I was 16 when Forrest Gump came out, so I'm pretty significantly older than you, but it's an interesting feeling because even when I watched it just 3 or 4 years later, I was mad. And what's funny, I then read the book to see if the book was that reactionary, and it's not.
Yeah, like
it's actually like it's a far more bitter satire on the baby boomers than that Slock is. But I think it's interesting how much that played to a certain, you know, generation, and how much that does encapsulate where movies went is like, okay, it doesn't seem to have politics, but it seems to kind of talk about everything. But yeah,
like look, it has politicians in it.
Yes, politicians in it, and like it has Black Panthers in it, and they're scary, but they're not bad. Maybe it's only the white ally that's bad, but we don't really know anything about the Panthers. They're just big and scary, and also AIDS is going to kill you. And Jenny being abused as a child and responding to it by becoming a slattern, dies of AIDS, and isn't it sad, but also justice somehow. And it's like, what?
But I mean, even the fact that he's like mentally challenged, and that's what, you know, it's an inspiring story of a mentally challenged man. It's like Oscar bait, you know what I mean? And, and that still works as Oscar bait. It's just maybe less reactionary in some ways. Like I don't think you could have, like, you know, the justice coming from the female character dying of AIDS now, you know what I mean? Like, to at least pretend that that's not the case.
It reminds me, I mean, it's actually interesting how that's still that reactionary sentiment was still so much in even mid to late 90s movies. Because I remember what, like, Patricia Highsmith, for example, would always talk about why she didn't write that many lesbian novels, because she didn't want to be deemed a lesbian writer, but also because she would dare to write books where the gay people didn't die at the end. Yeah. And I'm thinking about, like, how many, like, I'm going to feel for people movies that I see in the 90s that were supposedly, like, pro queer, that were like, watch person die of AIDS so that you can finally say something about AIDS, even though, like, we kind of actually by this point are beginning to do something about it.
Yeah.
Like, it's such a strange
well, there's a whole decade where like not only were they not doing anything about it, like, you know, I mean, like Reagan literally just didn't talk about it. Like the AIDS crisis was fully
happening. I remember. I grew up and had to have a blood transfusion in the 80s. I know. It's a crazy time to have lived through. I will also say, like, I think it's interesting that people don't talk about its effect on sexual attitudes all that much. I think AIDS and the dangerous erotic thriller of the late 80s, early 90s are reflections of each other, like pretty directly. And it was also a time where, like, I don't know. I mean, like, I was scared to death of sex because I grew up, I was in school, like my first memories of like the news are like Tiananmen Square and like Freddie Mercury dies of AIDS. And it's not just for gay people anymore. That was like, oh my God.
Not just for gay people anymore. That's the marketing,
which it never really was either. But like that was like the way that it was viewed in like the late 80s. And
I mean, bring up like Dallas Buyers Club again. It's interesting that it took kind of that long to make a movie about AIDS. That's like a giant movie about AIDS. That's just like, hey, by the way, straight people get it too. Like,
yeah, I mean, it
just kind of gets it from like banging a girl at a rodeo. Like, like they didn't try to scare you with the intravenous drug use with him specifically. Like, they didn't try to scare you with anything gay. Like, it's just kind of like, oh well, you could just have gotten it. And it's like, I can't think of another movie that I remember seeing before that where they kind of just show that, like, oh, you could have just gotten AIDS and not not even like been involved in any of the lifestyles that they're clearly trying to criminalize and crack down on and moralize against, which is why that narrative grew so big.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I do remember how many people that I mean, I know this sentiment is shocking now and we forget it, but how many people that I knew in the mainstream that you could read and be like, well, AIDS is just punishment from God.
Yeah.
I was like,
some people, I mean, there are some of the more hardcore evangelical Baptist pastors that still are down with saying that. Like, it's less popular in those circles, I guess, but like, there's still a few of them that slip it in there every once in a while. I bet if you had a nice long conversation with Mike Pence, like, just the two of you, like, I bet he'd still feel something like that. Like,
so it's an interesting thing to talk about. I think I'm going to wrap this up. I was going to talk about, can movies really be radical? But we've already really talked about that. And the answer is yes.
Part two episode.
Yeah. The answer is yes, but also no.
Yeah. No, that's really the answer that I've come, like, this movie podcast has brought me to. And like doing the streams on Give Them an Argument too, like when we were doing like the movie streams, like really my answer to that question is every single time yes and no. Like
it's like there's no way for if a filmmaker is being honest to the society that they live in, and they make a film, there's no way that it's not going to also contain all their aggressive elements in it too. Like, yeah. And actually, from the standpoint of Marxist literary criticism, right? And going back to Marx didn't even have a problem with that. Marx would actually talk about how some of the best art was reactionary art because they didn't try to like portray the world as anything other than what it was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think that there might have been a different take on that if kind of fascism had taken hold during Marx's life, because there's some very reactionary, extremely idealized like Nazi art where you look at it and you're like, no, nothing's ever fucking looked like that. Like what I'm looking at is kind of weirdly beautiful, like the films of, you know what I mean, like Nazi Germany, but also just like nothing looks like that. Like it's regression back into like a fairy tale format, and you're like, this is weird. I don't. This isn't the American kind of reactionary where we're just like, guess what? Military's here, baby. And the CIA, like.
I think what we forget about with fascism is there's a whole lot of other stuff, particularly to fascism. What I find interesting about fascist art, and I've said this to make people uncomfortable, but it's also true, is how close it is to Soviet art. Like, it's like a weird, it's just slightly different. I think that there's, I think that in both like the Soviet system and fascism,
there's an idea that, you know, the purpose of the government, the purpose of the state in that case, you know what I mean? Like the purpose of the party supersedes everything else. So when you see these incredibly like idealized, you know, depictions of things in art, it's because the one purpose of art, I think, within that system is to perpetuate like the you know what they're trying to perpetuate the message of a party. So I think in any case, when you know, if that is seen as the purpose of art, if all art is funded by that, you know what I mean, like, or all art that's funded is for that purpose, I think all the art that we would look at would look like that. Although, you know, the CIA's funding of like Jackson Pollock, like obviously that's the exact on purpose the exact opposite of Soviet art, because they're like, look, you can throw in America, we'll give you money to just throw paint on a fucking canvas. And
yeah, so it's something that I think we have to deal with. I mean, to be fair to Marx and reactionary art, most reactionary art in the modern context is really bad. Yeah. Or it doesn't know it's reactionary. I actually say most reactionary art is not aware that it's reactionary.
And most art kind of is reactionary in itself because it's kind of perpetuating a reactionary system. Like, you know what I mean? Like our state and our like capitalism itself is kind of is incredibly reactionary. So like, you know, if you're reflecting that funding system, like of course your art is going to be reactionary. Yeah. And I think that there's also during this exact question, something that I was thinking about when we were talking about this was like, you know, art by committee versus auteur art. I think that, you know, the auteur style of filmmaking is dying away. You know, it was only really like a few decades where that was a you know, like a prominent talked about thing.
Yeah, it's really from the late 60s to the early 90s, right?
Yeah. So the more people you bring into your collaborative process, the less your film can really say. So like, you know, when we're looking at like whether film can be radical, art by committee will never be radical. Mm-hmm. No matter how, even if it's like a radical committee, like, you know what I mean? Like, it just has to please too many different people.
I think that's as good a place as any of the ended. I was gonna like push back on that a little bit. I actually can't, because most Soviet film is also pretty anodyne. That's not all Soviet film, and it's not to say that they're all bad movies, but the movies that I can think of that are really interesting are still end up being kind of Arturish, Eisenstein, and a
committee can always, but also a committee can always delegate to an auteur. You know what I mean? Like it's
right,
it's
yeah, and they would, right? Like, yeah. But
when I talk about art by committee, I'm talking about like the modern like the modern like capitalist like player style, I'd say, because like in the player where they're kind of like, oh, we don't even need writers anymore. Look, we can just kind of pitch this around a room of producers and we can do exactly what the writers do. That's the kind of art I'm talking about, not the concept of having a committee that kind of decides on these things.
Yeah, I think from the production side, this is my last sentiment though, the auteurs got away with doing stuff that we shouldn't have accepted.
Yeah. Well, once again, Heart of Darkness. I was just watching that like 2 nights ago. Like,
you just watch, like, I'm watching stuff about John Landis. I'm watching stuff about Coppola. I'm watching anything you read about Kubrick. Kubrick hated actors. He also didn't seem to like women very much. Yeah. So it's you read about that and you're just like, wow, I almost feel weird about enjoying some of this.
He liked his wife. That was the one woman. That was, you know what I mean? Like, he's like, hey, go over there and paint and all, you know.
There are movies. There are also, I think we forget, there are bad Kubrick movies like Lolita, which is bad. It's just bad.
Watched that 2 months ago I finally was like curious and I was like, I'm gonna watch Lolita, and I made it like 3/4 of the way through it. I was like, I don't want to watch whatever's about to happen here. That was the second pedophile. God damn it. I saw it a really long time ago when I shouldn't, like, when I was too young to, like, you know what I mean, like, to process it. So it's not the first time I've seen Lolita, but like I don't know.
I'm going to drop a recommendation because I think it actually treats the differences between the books and all the films and cultural productions really well. And that is Jamie Loftus's Lolita podcast. Because I don't think the book is guilty of what every version of the book is guilty of. Which is a very interesting thing, particularly if you know about Nabokov's background. I've for my patrons, I did a whole monologue on quasi-defending Nabokov without doing the whole lame thing people do. But Lolita's a bad movie. Both versions. The Jeremy Iron movie is also bad.
I mean, who really wants to see that on screen anyway? Like,
well, I mean, like, that's why they always age Lolita up so that you do want to see it on screen.
Yeah,
like
but,
it's.
Like, but I'm saying, like, at its most base, like, who want, you know what I mean? Like, it's like this is like a horrible concept in the first place. Like, of course it is, you know what I mean? But then to like have to sit through it for 2 hours, it's like I don't want, like, there's no part of me that wants to, like,
right. So with that said, I think the yes and no answer is a frustrating non-committal answer that I think is also true. And so we'll end there. Thank you, Forrest, for coming on. What movies you doing this week, and where can they find you?
Oh, so we're kind of having a crazy week. So tomorrow I'm doing Tropic Thunder. And then we're doing Dawn of the Dead on Friday, and then we're doing Nightmare on Elm Street on Sunday. So I kind of have a insane podcast week. But patreon.com/movie night extravaganza or movie night extra, and YouTube/movie night extravaganza forward. Right. I wish both were available in the same thing, and they weren't.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Forrest. I'm sure that your people will see me again sometime.
Yeah.
And because you always need a bunch of people for your show.
Well, I've been trying to limit that, and then it's still every couple episodes ends up happening. I'm like, oh, I like this person, like they want to come on, and like, you know, like this person, like I was really happy that I was disciplined. I had Conan Neutron and Karthik supposed to come on yesterday for the Halloween stream, and then JG Michael was like, hey, like I really like Halloween. I've seen every single one. I'm like, oh, come on for sure. Then Kendall's like, I've seen everyone. I'm like, well, I can't say no. Like everyone's seen every Halloween. Like I haven't seen every sequel. So like let's bring you both on, and then next thing you know, it's like 5 people on screen again. And I'm like, oh, this is what I was.
Well, it's always a problem when you're doing a movie podcast because we all like movies. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on, Forrest. I'm gonna drop you out of patron business. So I have a bunch of Patreon shout outs today. I got to shout out my Khan Il Kahanan, which there's a lot now. Thank you guys for stepping up. Grimlock, thank you for joining the ranks of the great Khans. Habib Rahman, thank you for joining the ranks of the great Khans. Solution Space, thank you for joining the ranks of the great Khans. Joel Harold, thank you for growing the ranks of the great Khans. Zoe Sandra, thank you for joining the ranks of the great Khans. I think that's everybody. There's 5 of you. So that's where we're going to end off tonight. And thank you for joining us. Have a good night. Go watch some good movies. For those of you who are really into movies, Shallon Van Tyne and I are going to be talking about some movies in the next 2 months over on the Patreon side. Shallon is also a film lover, and we love to talk about pretentious movies that are really good, but also really pretentious. All right. Remember, you don't ever have to watch a bad movie. Bye.